The hall was enormous. It was the kind of place that was built to make you feel small on purpose. The ceiling stretched so high that the top of it disappeared into shadow. The walls were made of a dark stone that came from a planet no human had ever visited. 14 flags hung from the ceiling, one for each member species of the Interstellar Coalition. The human flag was there too, but it was placed at the far end of the row, near the back, almost out of sight. That had always been the case. The humans had stopped pointing it out years ago. Ambassador Serena Akafer walked into the Grand Conclave chamber with her small team behind her. She wore the standard diplomatic uniform, dark blue jacket, silver trim, the coalition emblem on her left shoulder. She had worn this uniform for 22 years. She had sat in this chamber more times than she could count. She knew every seat, every face, every trick, and every lie that had ever been told inside these walls. She took her seat at the human delegation table and opened her folder. The session began like every other session. Long speeches, complicated words used to say very simple things, compliments that were not real compliments, agreements that were not real agreements. The Vethkai delegates sat in the center of the room as they always did. They were tall, gray-skinned, and extremely proud of themselves. Their empire was the biggest in the coalition. What they said happened. What they wanted, they got. This had been true for a long time. Akafer listened and took notes. The item on the agenda that everyone had been waiting for came 3 hours into the session. It was called the Auxiliary Limitation Act. The title alone had made Akafer's jaw tighten when she first read it 3 weeks ago. She had read it again and again, hoping she was misunderstanding something. She was not misunderstanding anything. The act was simple. It said that humanity, officially listed in coalition records as primitive auxiliary species, Class 2, posed a systemic risk to rational coalition governance due to their emotional instability and unpredictable behavioral patterns. Therefore, effective immediately, human delegates would no longer hold voting rights in any coalition session. They could still attend. They could still speak if called upon, but their votes would no longer count. The Vethkai Grand Chancellor, Lethara the Unbroken, read the act aloud in her flat, precise voice. She did not look at the human delegation once while she read it. Akafer sat perfectly still. One of her junior diplomats, a young man named Marcus, leaned over and whispered, "Ambassador, do you want to respond now? We have the floor if—" She raised one finger, he stopped. The vote was called. 14 species voted, 13 voted yes. The Drossians abstained. No one voted no. The human delegation was not asked to vote because, as of that moment, their vote no longer existed. The chamber filled with the low sound of approval from most of the delegates. The Myarkai representative actually smiled. The Kethra delegates nodded to each other. The Vethkai sat back in their seats with the satisfied look of people who believed they had just done something very sensible. Lethara said, "The act passes. The record will reflect." Akafer stood up. The room went quiet, not because anyone was afraid of her. They went quiet because she had stood up in a way that was hard to ignore. She was not a large woman. She was not particularly imposing. But there was something in the way she stood straight, still, completely calm that made people stop talking and look at her. She looked around the room slowly. She did not rush. She looked at the Vethkai delegates, then the Myarkai, then the Drossians, then the Kethra. She looked at each table, each face, each species that had, at one point or another, needed something from humanity and gotten it. She thought about the Myarkai food crisis of 2271. Human agronomists had spent 11 years developing a hybrid crop system that saved an estimated 400 million Myarkai from starvation. The Myarkai government had sent a thank you letter. One letter. She thought about the Drossian Civil War. Human soldiers had been deployed as peacekeepers for 16 years. 2,341 of them had died on a planet that was not theirs, in a war that was not theirs, for people who now could not even be bothered to vote against stripping humanity of its rights. She thought about the border wars, the plague responses, the infrastructure projects, the medical missions, the endless negotiations where human diplomats stayed at the table long after everyone else had given up. She thought about all of it in about 4 seconds. Then she closed her folder. She picked up her coalition identification badge from the table. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set it down carefully, right in the center of the table, facing up so that everyone could see the coalition emblem on its face. She picked up her pen and set it down next to the badge. She straightened her jacket. And then Serena Akafor, senior ambassador of the human species, turned and walked toward the exit. She did not say a word, not one word. Marcus stood up immediately and followed her. The rest of the human delegation stood up one by one and followed as well, each of them setting their badges on the table before they left. The sound of the badges being placed on the hard surface, one after another, quiet and deliberate, was the only sound in the chamber. The door closed behind them. For a long moment, nobody in the chamber spoke. The Grand Chancellor stared at the line of badges on the human delegation's table. The Myarkai representative's smile had faded. Even the Vethkai, who almost never showed anything on their gray faces, looked uncertain. Then one of the junior Vethkai delegates leaned toward his senior and said, very quietly, "Should we?" "The session will continue," Lethara said firmly. And the session continued. What happened in the next 48 hours was quiet and fast and total. A message went out from Earth Command. It was encrypted, it was short, it was 2 words. Every human diplomat in coalition space received it. Every human soldier serving as a peacekeeper on a foreign world received it. Every human doctor working in a coalition medical outpost received it. Every human engineer maintaining coalition infrastructure. Every human scientist working in a coalition research facility. Every human contractor, trader, and advisor embedded in the wider galaxy. They all received the same 2 words at the same time. Come home. And they did. They did not make announcements. They did not give speeches or hold press conferences or write angry letters. They packed their things. They said goodbye to colleagues, in some cases colleagues they had worked beside for decades. Some of those goodbyes were hard. A few humans cried. A few of the aliens they said goodbye to looked confused or worried or guilty, though most of them did not fully understand yet what was happening. Then the humans boarded their ships and they came home. Within 48 hours, humanity's presence in coalition space had dropped from roughly 3 million individuals across hundreds of worlds to almost 0. The withdrawal was so clean and so fast that it felt, to those watching, less like a departure and more like a disappearance. On Earth, Akafor sat in her office in Geneva with a cup of tea and looked out the window at the city below. Marcus came in with a stack of reports and set them on her desk. "The last teams are confirmed home," he said. "We're fully out." She nodded and picked up her tea. "Any response from the coalition?" she asked. Grand Chancellor Lethara's office sent a formal inquiry asking for clarification on the nature of the withdrawal and whether humanity intends to file it, Akafor said. Marcus hesitated. "File it where?" She looked at him over her cup. "Somewhere quiet," she said. He nodded and left. She looked back out the window. The sky over Geneva was clear and blue. Below, the city moved the way it always moved, full of noise and people and life, completely unaware that something enormous had just happened. The galaxy had taken humanity for granted for 200 years. Now it would have to figure out what that meant. The first month was fine. That was the thing nobody expected to say later, that the first month was actually fine. The coalition kept running. Ships kept flying. Governments kept governing. There were no immediate disasters, no sudden collapses, no dramatic emergencies. Things just went on, the way things tend to go on when you remove something slowly and the hole it leaves isn't visible right away. The Vethkai issued a statement. It was confident and well-written, the way all their statements were. It said that the coalition had entered a new era of rational, stable governance, free from the emotional complications that had long been introduced by humanity's outsized presence in coalition affairs. It said this was a positive development. Several other species publicly agreed. A popular opinion columnist on the Myarkai homeworld wrote a widely read piece titled, "Why the Human Departure May Be the Best Thing to Happen to This Galaxy." It was shared across 11 star systems. On Earth, HFY read it over breakfast and said nothing. The second month was when the first cracks appeared. They were small at first. A food distribution network on the outer Myarkai agricultural world started running slow. The hybrid soil chemistry systems that human agronomists had designed and maintained for decades were not self-running. They needed calibration. They needed adjustment based on seasonal data and soil feedback that changed every few weeks. The humans who understood this system were gone. The Myarkai scientists who were assigned to take over quickly discovered that the documentation the human team had left behind was thorough, detailed, and written in a way that assumed the reader had at least a basic understanding of human agricultural engineering techniques. Almost no one in the coalition had that understanding, because for decades, if you needed agricultural engineering done, you called a human. The Myarkai assigned their best people to the problem. Their best people were genuinely intelligent and worked very hard. They made progress slowly. In the meantime, the crop yields on 4 worlds dropped by 30%. Around the same time, the Drossian relay stations started going dark. The relay stations were the backbone of long-distance communication across the coalition's eastern sectors. There were 47 of them, spread across a stretch of space that took months to cross by ship. They had been built 60 years ago using a mix of Drossian and human engineering. The Drossians had provided the theory. The humans had done the actual physical construction, and for reasons that seemed obvious at the time and catastrophic in hindsight, had also taken on the responsibility of ongoing maintenance. The Drossians had not objected to this arrangement. Manual technical work was, in their culture, considered beneath the intellectual class, and the intellectual class was the only class that held any real power in Drossian society. So humans had maintained the relay stations for 60 years, developing their own set of repair tools, diagnostic techniques, and informal knowledge that existed mostly in the heads of the engineers themselves, rather than in any formal document. When those engineers came home, they took that knowledge with them. Station 7 went dark first on a Tuesday, then Stations 12 and 13 within the same week. Coalition technicians were dispatched. They arrived, looked at the equipment, and sent back a message that made the Drossian Ministry of Communication go very still. The message said, "We don't know how this works." By the end of the second month, 9 stations were offline. Communication across the eastern sectors was slow and unreliable. Trade convoys were getting lost. Cargo was being delivered late or to the wrong coordinates. 2 colony ships heading to new settlement worlds had to turn back because they could not confirm the navigational data they needed. The Drossian Minister of Communication, a sharp and proud man named Veldris, submitted an official request to the Coalition High Council asking for emergency technical support. The High Council discussed the matter at length. They concluded that the situation was manageable and that coalition engineers from member species were fully capable of resolving the issue in time. Veldris went home that evening and sat in his garden for a long time. The HFY War started again in the 3rd month. This was the one that hurt the most because people died. The HFY border conflict was a dispute between 2 HFY factions over a cluster of resource-rich moons. It had been running in some form for nearly 100 years. Human diplomats had been involved in mediating it for 60 of those years. They had developed relationships with both sides, learned the cultural pressure points that could be used to pull people back from the edge, understood which leaders were genuinely interested in peace and which ones were posturing. With the humans gone, the mediation fell to the coalition's standard diplomatic corps. They were professional. They were well-trained. They followed the correct protocols. They didn't know the Kethra the way the humans did. Within 8 weeks of the withdrawal, a border skirmish erupted over Moon 14. C3 Kethra warships were destroyed. Both factions blamed the other. The peace talks collapsed in a single session. Within 10 days, it was a full war again. The coalition dispatched peacekeeping forces. They were stretched thin because 3 other minor conflicts had also flared up in regions where human mediators had previously been keeping the peace. It was becoming clear, to those paying attention, that humanity's diplomatic presence had been quietly holding together an enormous number of situations that no one had ever formally acknowledged or counted. Savan was one of the people paying attention. She was a junior analyst in the HFY Office of Strategic Assessment. She was 26 years old, small even by HFY standards, and extremely good at her job in a quiet way that her supervisors had noticed but not yet properly rewarded. Her job was to track data and identify patterns. She was very good at both. She had been tracking the withdrawal's effects since the first week. At first her data was thin, a few small disruptions, nothing serious. By the 3rd month her spreadsheets were enormous and her sleep was poor. She compiled everything into a single report. She titled it simply, Human Contribution Assessment, Post-Withdrawal Impact Analysis. It was 412 pages long. She spent 2 days checking and rechecking the numbers because she did not want to be wrong. She was not wrong. She brought it to her direct supervisor, a senior analyst named Morthek. He read the executive summary, which was 6 pages, and his face changed 3 times in the space of reading it. When he finished, he looked up at her. "These numbers cannot be right," he said. "I checked them 6 times," she said. "They are right." He read the summary again. This says that humanity was maintaining or directly supporting 43% of the coalition's active infrastructure at the time of withdrawal. Yes. And that their diplomatic involvement was a primary stabilizing factor in over 60 ongoing regional situations. 62, yes. He set the report down. He looked at the wall. How did no one know this? Savan had thought about this question for days. She had an answer, but it was an uncomfortable one. "Because they never made us know," she said. "They just did the work. They never built leverage out of it. They never threatened to stop. They never even asked to be properly credited. They just showed up and fixed things and left again." Morthek was quiet for a while. Then he picked the report back up and stood. "I'm taking this to the High Council." He did. He presented it in a closed session 2 days later. The council members read sections of it in silence. The HFY Grand Chancellor Lethara read the full executive summary without looking up once. When Morthek finished presenting, the room was very quiet. One of the Myerkai counselors said, almost to himself, "We laughed at them when they left." Nobody responded to that. Lethara said, carefully, "What is the current status of communication attempts with Earth?" A communications officer at the side of the room said, "We've sent 14 formal messages, Chancellor. We've received automated confirmation of receipt on each one. No other response." The room was quiet again. "Send another," Lethara said. It was sent. Like the others, it was received and not answered. Earth was not angry. Earth was not making demands. Earth was simply not there anymore, in the way that a foundation is not there once a house has been lifted off it, and the house is only then starting to understand what a foundation actually does. Nobody outside of human space knew what was happening inside it. That was intentional. Earth had not closed its borders. It had not blocked communication. If someone sent a message to a human contact, that human contact might even reply politely, briefly, with nothing of substance. If a coalition ship flew through human space, it was allowed to pass. Nobody was stopped. Nobody was threatened. Humanity simply went about its business and did not broadcast what that business was. This turned out to be one of the more frightening things about the whole situation, though the galaxy did not understand this yet. Back home, things moved fast. The first thing that changed was the pace. For 2 centuries, human science and engineering had operated inside a framework of coalition standards, coalition regulations, and coalition approval processes. You wanted to test a new propulsion concept. You filed a request with the Coalition Science Board, waited 8 months for approval, received 14 pages of restrictions, and then proceeded. You wanted to build a new kind of reactor. You needed sign-off from 3 different oversight committees, representing species who did not fully understand the technology, but had the political standing to block it. All of that was gone now. Human scientists did not throw safety out the window. They were not reckless. They were careful, methodical people who understood consequences. But there is a significant difference between careful and slow. With no one to ask permission from, projects that had been sitting in proposal stages for years were suddenly given the green light. Labs that had been operating at 60% capacity were now running full-time. Researchers who had spent careers navigating bureaucratic slowdowns suddenly found themselves working in environments where the only question that mattered was, can we make this work? Project Prometheus was the one that mattered most. It had been running in some form since 2201, a long-term research program focused on stable large-scale fusion. The Coalition had its own fusion technology, but it was old, and it was efficient enough that no one had felt a strong need to improve it significantly. Human scientists had believed for decades that a better approach was possible. The Coalition Science Board had classified the project as non-urgent supplementary research and funded it accordingly, which meant barely. 6 months after the withdrawal, Project Prometheus achieved what its lead scientist, Dr. Yemisi Ademi, described in her lab notes simply as the thing we were trying to do. The new reactor design produced stable fusion output at a scale and efficiency that made the Coalition's existing technology look like a campfire next to a star. It could power a city. It could power a fleet. It was clean, it was scalable, and it was real. Ademi stood in the observation room and looked at the output readings for a long time. Then she went to get a cup of coffee, came back, looked at them again, and said to her team, "All right, let's build a bigger one." They did. Meanwhile, the Helios shipyards on the far side of Mars were doing things that would have made the Coalition's military analysts reach for their medications, if the Coalition's military analysts had known about them. The Sovereignty-class warship program had been in quiet development for 15 years, funded privately and kept well off any official radar. The design was based on a simple principle. Every previous generation of human ship had been built with Coalition compatibility in mind, which created compromises. The Sovereignty class was built with no compromises. It was built for one purpose and one purpose only, which was to be the most capable vessel a human crew could operate. The first completed Sovereignty-class ship was called the Akafir. It was named without ceremony by the engineering team who built it, who felt this was appropriate. It conducted its first full weapons and propulsion trials on a quiet Tuesday afternoon over the asteroid belt. The test results were not shared with anyone outside the program. But not everything happening in human space was about weapons or power. A man named Dr. Theo Bassett had spent the previous 18 years trying to get Coalition approval for a large-scale terraforming initiative. His proposal was straightforward. There were hundreds of worlds in the galaxy's outer regions that could support life with the right environmental adjustments. Most of these worlds were unclaimed, unvisited, and ignored by the major species because they were far away, and the process of making them livable was considered too long and too expensive. Bassett had developed a method that shortened that process significantly. The coalition had reviewed his proposal 4 times and told him each time that it was not a coalition priority. Now it was a human priority. Bassett's teams deployed to 17 target worlds simultaneously. They worked fast, using the new fusion power systems to run the environmental equipment at full scale. Within 6 months, 3 worlds had breathable atmospheres. Within a year, the first settlers were arriving. These were not large settlements yet, a few thousand people each, but they were real, and they were growing, and they were part of something bigger. That bigger thing was called the Terran Compact. The idea had come from HFY, though she would later say it had come from necessity, which amounted to the same thing. Humanity had left the coalition, but leaving the coalition did not mean leaving the galaxy. There were hundreds of species out there who had never been given a fair seat at any table. Some of them were small. Some were technically underdeveloped by coalition standards. Some had been rejected for coalition membership, or had applied and been kept waiting for decades in a kind of permanent maybe. They had been called fringe species, primitive species, non-essential species. HFY sent personal envoys to 37 of them. The message her envoys carried was not complicated. It said, "We are building something new. You are welcome in it. Your size does not matter. Your technology level does not matter. Your past does not matter. You have a voice here. Come and use it." 37 species said yes. The Terran Compact Charter was written over the course of 4 months by a team of human legal and diplomatic minds working alongside representatives from every founding species. It was a careful document, built on clear principles: equal representation, mutual defense, open trade, and a shared commitment to the idea that the measure of a civilization was not how powerful it was, but how it treated the ones less powerful than itself. It was, in the opinion of several founding members who had previously dealt with the coalition, the fairest political document they had ever seen. The Compact held its first internal session quietly on a station orbiting Europa. There were no announcements, no press releases, no statements to the wider galaxy, just 38 delegations sitting in a room, working through their agenda, building something. It was a coalition intelligence officer, named Withdrawal, who first put the full picture together. He had been compiling fragments for months, shipping manifests that didn't add up, energy readings from human space that were larger than expected, reports from fringe species of unusual diplomatic contact. None of it had seemed alarming on its own. Put together, it was a very different story. He delivered his report to the Vethkai High Admiral, a veteran military officer named Salek, known throughout the military for his composure and his ability to look at bad situations without flinching. Withdrawal walked him through the report section by section: the fusion reactor data, the shipyard activity, the terraforming projects, the Terran Compact membership list, which Withdrawal had assembled from fragments and was still not complete, though it already showed 32 names. The High Admiral listened to all of it without interrupting. When Withdrawal finished, there was a silence. Then Withdrawal pulled up the footage. It was blurry, taken from a drone at long range. It showed a large ship conducting what appeared to be a weapons test somewhere over the asteroid belt. The footage was 22 seconds long. It showed one firing sequence, a single event. The energy output reading in the corner of the frame was extremely hard to look at without feeling something cold move through you. The High Admiral watched it once, then he watched it again, then he watched it a third time. He reached across his desk, picked up a glass of something amber, and took a long drink. 6 months, he said quietly. They did all of this in 6 months. Withdrawal said nothing. We stripped them of their vote, the Admiral said, mostly to himself, because we thought they were too emotional to be trusted. He turned the glass slowly in his hand. And in 6 months without us, they built a new fusion age, a warship I don't know how to fight, a terraforming program, and an alliance of 32 species that nobody told us about. He set the glass down. "What have we done?" he said. It was not a question. Grand Chancellor Lethara had never traveled to negotiate. In 30 years of political life that had been a fixed rule, people came to her. Ambassadors flew to Vethkai Prime. Delegations arranged themselves around her schedule. This was not arrogance for the sake of it, it was a deliberate signal. One that every species in the coalition understood clearly. If you want something from us, you come to us. The Vethkai were at the center. Everyone else arranged themselves accordingly. Which made it a very significant event when, on a cold morning in the 10th month after the human withdrawal, Lethara boarded a ship personally and flew to Earth's moon. She brought the largest diplomatic delegation the coalition had assembled in its 300-year history, representatives from all 14 member species, senior officials, cultural liaisons, legal advisors, economic specialists. They filled 2 large transport vessels. The convoy was escorted by a small fleet of coalition warships, partly for security and partly because arriving with a fleet felt, to some of the coalition's older members, more comfortable than arriving without one. The human response to the convoy's approach was polite and unremarkable. They were guided to a docking station orbiting the moon. They were greeted by a small human customs and reception team. They were offered food and water and directed to their assigned quarters in the Lunar Diplomatic Station, a facility that, Lethara noted, was well built, clean, and larger than the intelligence reports had suggested. Lethara stood at the observation window in her quarters and looked down at the gray surface of the moon and the blue curve of Earth beyond it. She had seen images of Earth before but had never been this close. It was a strikingly alive-looking planet, green and blue and white, constantly moving. It looked, she thought, like a place that was always busy. She slept poorly that night. The meeting began at 9 in the morning, Earth Standard Time. The conference room was good without being extravagant. Long table, clean lighting, comfortable chairs. A human staff member moved quietly around the edges of the room, making sure water glasses were full. Through the wide window on one side, you could see the dark sky above the moon and the stars beyond it. Serena Akefer arrived exactly on time. She looked the same as she had the last time Lethara had seen her, the day she walked out of the conclave chamber. Same posture, same calm face. She wore a deep blue jacket without a coalition emblem on it, which was its own kind of statement. Behind her came a small team of advisors, including the young diplomat Marcus, who had grown noticeably more serious in the past year. Lethara had prepared for many versions of this meeting. She had prepared for anger. She had prepared for demands and ultimatums and dramatic speeches. She had prepared for the kind of wounded pride that sometimes makes people difficult to deal with. She had not quite prepared for the version of Akafer that walked in, which was the version that seemed to have no particular emotion about any of this at all. Not coldness, that would have been something to work with. Just a complete, settled calm, like a person who has already made up their mind about everything important and is simply here to see how the details unfold. They exchanged formal greetings. They sat. They were offered tea, which Lethara accepted, more for something to do with her hands than out of any real desire for it. Then Lethara began. She had written and rewritten the opening statement many times. In the end, she had decided that the most effective approach was also the most straightforward one. She told the truth. She said the coalition had made a serious error. She said the Auxiliary Limitation Act had been unjust, and she was formally withdrawing it, effective immediately, with a full expungement from the coalition record. She said that humanity's contributions to the coalition had been systematically undervalued, and that the coalition was prepared to acknowledge this formally in a joint public statement. She said that a permanent seat on the High Council, not an auxiliary position, but a full, equal, permanent seat, was being offered unconditionally. She paused there because those were significant offers, and she expected them to land. They landed, but not in the way she expected. HFY listened to all of it with the same expression she had walked in with, attentive, polite, not cold but not moved either. When Lethara finished, HFY nodded once, as if she was confirming something she had already expected to hear. Then she said, "Thank you, Chancellor. Those are meaningful statements and I want to acknowledge them seriously." She paused. "Before I respond, I'd like to share something with you and your delegation." She looked to Marcus, who placed a document on the table and slid a copy to each person on the coalition side. It was a bound booklet, perhaps 60 pages. On the cover, in plain text, were the words, "Terran Compact, Founding Charter and Member Registry." Lethara picked it up. She opened it. The member registry was on the third page. 38 species, listed alphabetically. Lethara read the list once and then turned to the section that outlined the compact's structure. There was a security and mutual defense clause, a trade framework, a science and technology sharing agreement, a development fund for member species that needed infrastructure support, a dispute resolution process that was notably more efficient than the coalition's equivalent. The Myrkai delegate on the coalition side quietly turned to the registry page and stared at it. On the registry was the name of a species called the Vareth, a small, quiet civilization that had applied for coalition membership 11 times over 40 years and been rejected each time, most recently 3 years ago, on the grounds that their homeworld was too far from major trade routes to be economically worthwhile. They had full membership in the Terran Compact. They had helped write the Development Fund section. The Myrkai delegate turned the page back over. HFY spoke again. Her voice was steady and clear. "The Terran Compact is operational and growing," she said. "It currently represents 38 species, with 4 additional applications under consideration. It has its own economic and defense infrastructure, its own governing principles, and its own trajectory." She looked around the table. "Humanity appreciates the coalition's offer, and we take it in the spirit it was intended. But we are not looking to return to the coalition, Chancellor. We have built something new." The room was quiet. Lethara said carefully, "You're saying you won't rejoin." "I'm saying," HFY replied, "that the question of rejoining is no longer the relevant question." She put her hand on the charter booklet. "The Terran Compact is not an alternative to the coalition. We have no interest in being in conflict with the coalition. What we're proposing is a relationship between 2 separate bodies, trade agreements, information sharing, mutual recognition of territorial boundaries, and where interests align, collaborative projects." She paused. "The coalition is welcome to apply for associate membership in the Terran Compact. The process is open and the terms are fair." There was a very long silence. The Vethkai High Admiral, who was sitting 2 seats to Lethara's left, looked at the charter booklet in his hands as if he was not entirely sure it was real. One of the Drossian delegates leaned forward. "Associate membership," he repeated slowly. "You want the coalition to apply for associate membership in your organization." "I wouldn't put it in terms of want," HFY said, with the small, genuine, warm smile of someone who has said something accurate and is not going to apologize for it. "I would say the option is available." Another silence. It was Lethara who spoke next, and she did something that surprised the people who knew her best. She set down the formal posture, the careful phrasing, the political distance. She looked at HFY simply, one person to another, and asked the question she had been carrying for 10 months. "Did you plan all of this?" she said, "from the moment you walked out?" The question was real. Lethara genuinely wanted to know whether she had sat in that chamber, heard the vote, and in the space of standing up and walking out had already mapped the path to this room. HFY looked at her for a moment. Then she reached to the side of the table, picked up the teapot, and refilled the Chancellor's cup. "We're human," she said simply. "We always have a plan B." Lethara looked at her cup. Then, for the first time in the meeting, possibly for the first time in years, she smiled. It was a small smile, and it carried something complicated in it. Something that might have been respect or regret, or the particular feeling you get when you understand too late what you had. "Your terms," she said, "for the associate membership, are they reasonable?" "Very," HFY said. "Then let us read them." They read them. The Terran Compact Assembly Hall orbited Europa. It had been built in 7 months, which was fast even by human standards, and which said something about how seriously humanity had taken the idea. It was not the largest structure in the solar system. That distinction still belonged to the old Coalition way station near Jupiter. But it was, by general agreement of the people who saw it, the most thoughtfully designed. It was built in a ring shape, wide and open, with a central chamber large enough to seat 300 delegates comfortably. Every seat was the same size. Every delegation's flag hung at the same height. The lighting was set to be comfortable for 17 different kinds of eyes. The environmental systems could adjust temperature and air composition by section, so that no species had to be uncomfortable in order for another species to be comfortable. These were small details. But small details, HFY had always believed, were how you told people the truth about what you thought of them. The inaugural full session of the Terran Compact was scheduled for a Tuesday. Delegates began arriving the day before. Ships from 38 different home systems, some large and fast, some small and old, docked at the ring's outer ports over the course of 24 hours. Human dock workers helped each ship in without fuss, directing traffic, solving small problems, making sure everyone found their way. Savan arrived on a mid-sized transport that had made 4 stops on the way from Vethkai Prime. She was not arriving as a Vethkai delegate. The Vethkai delegation had its own ship. She was arriving as staff of the Terran Compact's newly established Office of Historical Documentation, where she had taken a position 4 months ago after submitting a resignation letter to the Vethkai Office of Strategic Assessment that her former supervisor Morthek had described as the most politely devastating document I have ever read. She had spent those 4 months finishing the paper she had started in her mind on the night she first compiled the human contribution data. It was titled The Hidden Architecture, How Humanity Built the Galaxy and Was Never Thanked. It was methodical, honest, and thorough. It did not exaggerate. It did not need to. The facts, presented plainly and in sequence, were more than enough to make their point. Compact leadership had arranged for it to be distributed to every member species, and in a decision that caused some debate, to the Coalition as well. It was not sent as an accusation. It was sent as a record. The cover letter that went with it said simply, "For the Historical Archive, so this does not happen again." Morthek, back on Vethkai Prime, had read the finished paper in his office one afternoon. He had sat very still for a while afterward. Then he had sent Savan a message that said, "Well done. You were always my best analyst. I'm sorry the Compact got to you first." She had written back, "Thank you. I learned the work from you." She still thought of him fondly. The morning of the session, HFY arrived at the assembly hall early. She walked the main corridor alone before the crowds came, looking at the flags, checking the room the way she always checked rooms before important events, not out of anxiety, but out of habit. She had learned early in her career that the best way to be calm during a difficult meeting was to be familiar with the space before the meeting started. She had done this before every major diplomatic event of her life. She stood in the central chamber for a few minutes. It was quiet. The seats were all empty. The flags hung still. The lights were on but soft, the way they were in the early morning hours before the settings adjusted for a full session. Marcus found her there. He came and stood beside her and also looked at the room. "How are you feeling?" he asked. It was a real question, the kind he had started asking about a year ago when he stopped thinking of her as a figure to be formal with and started thinking of her as a person he respected. She appreciated it. "Like it worked," she said. He nodded. "It did." "It almost didn't," she said. "There were 20 moments where it almost didn't." "I know," he said. "I was at most of them." She smiled. You did good work, Marcus." He looked at the flags. "Do you think they'll hold, the compact, I mean, long term?" It was a fair question, and she gave it real thought before answering. "I think any institution is only as good as the people running it and the values they actually keep when things are hard," she said. "We've written good values into this one. Whether we hold to them will depend on us." She looked at him. "Which is true of every institution everywhere always." Very diplomatic answer. "I'm a diplomat." He laughed, which was a good sound to hear in the empty chamber. Then the first delegates began arriving through the corridor doors, and the day became busy, and there was no more time for quiet conversation. The coalition delegation arrived as a group. Lethara was at the front. She had been to the lunar station for the negotiations, but this felt different. That had been a private meeting between two parties. This was a public event, attended by 38 species, at which the coalition was present not as the most powerful body in the room, but as an associate member. A guest, in some sense. An observer with a voice but not a vote. She had thought about this on the flight over. She had expected to find it more uncomfortable than it actually felt. The discomfort was there, but it was smaller than she had anticipated, and underneath it was something else she had not expected, a quiet, genuine interest. The compact was something new. It was organized in ways the coalition had never tried. The species in it were ones the coalition had dismissed. Watching it operate, even from the outside, was not unpleasant. She found her seat in the section assigned to coalition delegates. It was a good seat. Not a special seat, it was the same as every other seat, which was, she understood, the point. Savan was sitting 2 rows behind her. When Lethara turned and their eyes met, Savan gave a small, slightly uncertain nod. Lethara held her gaze for a moment, then nodded back, with more warmth than she had intended. The young analyst's paper had affected her more than she had admitted to anyone. Reading it had been the experience of seeing, all at once, the full shape of a mistake that she had been standing inside for so long that she had stopped being able to see its edges. It was not a pleasant experience, but it was a necessary one. The session opened with a short welcome address from the Compact's first Secretary General, an older woman from one of the founding fringe species, the Varith, named Inala. She had been chosen by unanimous vote, and she was not a showy speaker. She spoke plainly and briefly, welcomed everyone, and said that the Compact's first order of business was a development proposal from a species that had joined 3 months ago and needed help building water reclamation infrastructure on their homeworld. And then the session simply began. Real business, real agenda, the kind of work that institutions do when they are actually functional. Akafar sat at the human delegation table and watched the room. She watched the Varith delegates lean in as their proposal was discussed with full seriousness by the assembled members. She watched 2 small species who had been rivals for decades sitting at the same table, working through a trade framework that human mediators had helped develop. She watched Savan at the back of the room taking notes in her careful way. Near the end of the session, Lethara stood to deliver the coalition's formal address, the statement of acknowledgement and cooperation that had been agreed upon in the lunar negotiations. It was a remarkable speech, genuinely. She said things that no leader of the coalition had ever said publicly before. She used the word failed in reference to the coalition's treatment of humanity and of the fringe species. She used the word grateful, directed at humanity, which was a word that had clearly cost her something to include, and which landed differently because of it. When she finished, the chamber was quiet for a moment. Then the delegates began the formal response. By the protocol of the Compact, the response to a coalition address was delivered by the Secretary General on behalf of all members. Inala rose, but she looked toward Akafar first, a small gesture of acknowledgement before she spoke. And then Akafar did the thing that the people who knew her best had half expected, and the people who didn't know her would spend years talking about. She rose from her seat. Not to speak. She did not take the floor. She did not request the podium. She simply stood and looked around the room at the flags, at the faces, at the coalition delegates and the fringe species delegates, and the new members and the founding members, at this whole strange, imperfect, genuinely hopeful room full of people trying to do better than the last group of people had done. She looked at Lethara, who met her eyes. And then Akefer nodded. Just once. The same kind of nod she had given at the end of the lunar negotiations. Not a bow, not a surrender, not a victory gesture, just a nod, the nod of someone who has finished a very long piece of work and is acknowledging that it is done, and it is good, and it is enough. Lethara held her gaze for a moment. Then slowly she nodded back. Anala spoke, the session continued, the work went on. Outside the windows of the assembly hall, Europa's cracked ice surface caught the distant light of the sun. Further out, the gas giant Jupiter turned in its slow permanent storm. And further still, in every direction, the galaxy continued, enormous and ancient and full of problems that needed solving and conflicts that needed mediating and worlds that needed building and people who needed help. There was, as always, a great deal of work to do. The humans were already thinking about it. The galaxy had many words for what happened that year. Some called it a revolution. Some called it a reckoning. Historians would eventually call it the Great Realignment and write about it in textbooks for centuries to come. Philosophers from a dozen species wrote long papers about what it meant. Politicians gave speeches about the lessons it taught. The humans, characteristically, had only one word for it. Finally, end.